reverse the abnormal ion channel function at the root of this illness. We are so happy to have him here with us today. Please welcome Dr. Lossin.
I'd actually, let's see if I'm in the picture. I'd like to begin actually by extending a thank you to Janet Stone, who apparently is not here today. She's the person who promoted my name to the association and made my name essentially knowledgeable to everybody, and that's why I'm standing here in front of you today to talk a little bit about myotonia congenita. She has also put together a wonderful website on myotoniacongenita.org, which basically compiles all kinds of information that's relevant to patients. And of course, thank you to Jake and Linda for organizing and having me here. So this is a wonderful opportunity for me. I'd like to begin my talk really by showing this picture, which is what I would have chosen had I written an autobiography at the age of 10. My mother, I said to my mother, if I ever write an autobiography, I will choose that picture or any kind of picture of stairs. Because wherever I am, I try and seek out where's the next flight of stairs. I'm basically traumatized by stairs. Not that I'm afraid of them, but the fact that I walk upstairs and the first 2 steps are okay, but then I freeze up because I start cramping. Stairs are always an obstacle. I always need to know where's the next flight of stairs. And I'm actually quite happy standing here in front of you, not having to walk upstairs to the podium. It would be terrible. I would hate it. Anyway, oops, feedback. I could have also maybe chosen this picture here, which shows a track and field track. Obviously, PE, physical education, was always a problem for me. To this day, when I smell the scent of hot rubber, the stuff that's making up these tracks, turns my stomach upside down. And seeing these starting blocks and remembering the times when I was literally forced in PE to do relays, basically the ridicule of my classmates, it was quite challenging. I could also choose this picture here, which is simply representative of public transportation. Whenever I enter a train, I'm on a need-to-know basis. When do we stop? Where can I sit? I will strategically seek out the best possible spot for me to sit so that I know I can get out. I know that I don't have to retrieve my luggage from an overhead compartment, because at that point I may not be able to. I don't want to walk around people because I need to hold on to something. So as soon as I enter the train, I seek out where can I sit? Where can I be? Where can my luggage be, so that I don't end up in a situation when essentially I need to get off and the doors are open in front of me and I can't go anywhere. I can't get off. Or the last picture that would be representative, the rings, which are basically an example of, again, PE, where my teacher just told me, well, just try hard. Of course, I could also say, why don't you try hard to walk through that wall? There's only one certainty, that in both cases somebody is going to get hurt. In this case, I knew when I was swinging on the rings that I won't be able to hold on to it. There's the effect of transient weakness in myotonia that I will be talking about a little bit, where suddenly you simply cannot produce any force anymore. So I was swinging on the rings and I knew it was going to happen, and at the top of the swing I released. I couldn't hold on, and just barely made it on the mat. And that was the day I walked out of PE and I said, that's it, forget it. I'm not doing it anymore. And that's not to say that I dislike sports, quite the contrary. I love sports. But I choose today sports where I can decide what to do, not where somebody else tells me, okay, now it's your turn in relay or something like that. That I cannot do. So I do a lot of biking. So growing up, I tend to walk around too. I shouldn't do that. Growing up, I simply said I had stiff legs. I had a muscular physique, people looking at me. The physicians that we would seek out, for this disorder, it's so rare nobody really knows much about it back then, in the 70s and 80s, is when we started comprehending myotonia. But at the time there was also no internet around. Neurologists simply did not know what this is. So here I am, a kid, 10 years old, and I come to a doctor and he looks at me and he goes, "My God, your dad must be Hercules." And I come to this doctor to tell him, "I can't use my muscle." And it doesn't work. It creates a conflict, and you wonder constantly, what are you doing wrong? What is it that I'm doing wrong? So what happens is you trip, and because of the tripping, this, by the way, is happening all the time. It's not, as I now learned, myotonia is apparently only present in periodic paralysis during an episode, during an attack. In myotonia congenita, it's permanent. It's always there. It never leaves me unless I have warm-up, and then it goes away transiently. But for me, always, tripping is a big hazard. Incidentally, as I was walking out from FedEx, from Kinko's, I had just dropped off Linda's flash drive. My father was with me, and I tripped over something, and it was a bizarre situation because it was the slowest fall I ever had, because I completely seized up, and there's nothing I can do. And I said to my father, "I'm going to fall, I'm going to fall." And of course I fell over, and he was probably more distraught than I was, because he saw it, I fell over like a board, the typical tripping over like a board, with no apparent will to right myself. Why? Because I can't. My muscle freezes up, so to speak, in that position. So that's definitely a hazard, and it's a big problem with myotonia. I've seen many doctors and done EEGs, EKGs. One of the more useful suggestions was to drink milk and go jogging, which I actually find is keeping a healthy lifestyle is very, very good for myotonia congenita. But of course, the notion of just do your best and just try hard, unfortunately, it doesn't work. And surely, in case of a fire, I cannot just run away. That does not work. And the disadvantages or the conflicts and problems are not only limited to the physical limitation, but also in school, for example, I was viewed as a rebel student because I could always get up very slowly. And they thought that was provocative. My teachers thought I was provoking them, not wanting them to contribute when I was called to the board, which I hated, of course. So there's a lot of misunderstanding, and I only recognized that later when my teachers told me, "You always got up so slowly." I said, "I can't. It's not possible for me to get up quickly." So having all these issues, there was essentially an endless wondering at my end, what is it? What can I do? What is the body position? Maybe it's some food, that magically fixes it. Maybe, I don't know, what is it that stops the cramping? And I decided to go inside. That's what I decided to do, to start studying biology and start understanding it better. So that's a little bit about me. I've subdivided the talk, actually, the actual talk about myotonia into 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk briefly about how it doesn't come to the name of Thompson, and how it doesn't come to the name of Becker, and some of the seminal contributions of modern scientists to myotonia research. In the second part, I'm going to talk about myotonia physiology. That's where it gets a little bit biophysical. And I know it's after lunch. I hope I'm not losing you at that time. Talk about ion channels. By the way, I'm extremely impressed by the level of knowledge in this room already about ion channels. Usually when I talk to people, they don't know what ion channels are. So possibly some of the stuff that I'm presenting is too simple. I will also talk a little bit about animal models in myotonia, and then finally I dive a little bit into the myotonia therapy and what we can do about myotonia and how we can find out. So first, a little bit of history. It's a very rare disorder, of course, congenital myotonia, and first reported really in 1830 by Charles Bell. He was a Scottish physician, and he wrote, "Thus, a gentleman capable of great bodily exertion on going to hand a lady to the dining room will stagger like a drunken man." And in the streets, any sudden noise or occasion of getting quickly out of the way will cause him to fall down, and in this manner, a want of confidence produces a nervous excitement, which increases the evil. There's, of course, much more extensive description of the condition in Bell's manuscript, but essentially he was the first to really describe it. And then, roughly 34 years later, a German physician, Ernst von Leyden, described the case in a little bit more detail. And he wrote back then, the musculature of the body, especially that of the extremities, demonstrated an athletic development. He complains only of pronounced stiffness. The various muscle groups will not promptly respond to woeful initiated movement. If only mildly flexed, the fingers can be rapidly extended. However, if the fist is tightly closed, it is impossible for him to extend the fingers immediately. He rather rolls out one finger after the other with great effort, and it appears as if he has to overcome considerable resistance. After executing this manner several times, however, the extension now goes smoothly, as if the muscles have become more elastic. So this is exactly what Tayo was trying to do. You did very well, you did very well. I didn't want to take it away from you. So, yeah, this is the major problem in myotonia, essentially, that you have this warm-up phenomenon, of course, and people start wondering, is this guy for real? In 1876, then, Asmus Julius Thomas Thomsen, he was a German physician, he's not to be confused with a Danish chemist of almost the same name. He was himself afflicted with the disorder, and he lived a good life. He was a physician, obviously, and was successful in his practice. But his son, who was also afflicted with it, he was accused of malingering and trying to evade military service. And upon that incident, Thomsen really decided, no, I have to stand up basically for my son and write an account. And he recognized the hereditary nature of the disorder and described up to his great-grandmother the condition in great detail. It's unfortunately written in German, so it's fine for me. I can read it, but I grew up in Germany. Unfortunately, it's not available, to my knowledge, in English. Then, in 1881, the term that Thomsen originally suggested for myotonia, which was ataxia muscularis, was actually replaced by another term by Ernst von Schlegel. He said this, he referred to it as myotonia, and then 2 years later, Carl Westphal suggested to honor, in honor of Thomsen's work, to name the disorder Thomsen's disease. And these two terms really stuck until today. It's what we use today, myotonia and Thomsen's disease, which is a dominantly inherited disorder, meaning it will show up essentially in every single generation. In 1961, German neurologist Peter Emil Becker recognized, or published for the first time, that he was thinking that there's a distinct separate disorder that is not dominantly inherited, but recessively, where essentially, in simple terms, the disorder skips a generation. He spent a great part of his life compiling information on the disorder, writing literally thousands of letters around Germany, and he came up with a wonderful book that these days is very hard to come by, the 1977 Small Thema book, which I gladly found on the internet at some point, so I have one of the copies. In his honor, it's now called Becker's disease. And of course, there are contributions after this. People figured out what is the problem, what is the molecular cause of myotonia. Their names, Reinhard Rüdiger, Brian, in Australia, Alan Brettag, they formulated, the chloride hypothesis, that chloride must be something doing here that's, where chloride must be involved in some way. Barkey doing some modeling, mathematical modeling, that's still valid today. Harald Jokusch in Germany, and of course Franklin Manhon, also in Germany, contributing lots of information and lots of detail that we now consider standard in myotonia.
First time we hear his name pronounced correctly, I think.
And Kenneth Ricker, I'm not sure if Kenneth sounds very English to me, but Ricker could be German, I don't know.
He's German.
He's German? Kenneth Ricker, okay. Manuela Koch and L. George, these were the people that figured out very basic mechanisms, the pathomechanisms in myotonia. They figured out what is the culprit protein here, what are we talking about, where is that gene that brings about myotonia. And then later on, of course, we have the contributions by Colin Jorgensen, Dunno, Mike Hanna in London, of course, here present, Dr. Trivedi and Dr. Cannon, and Rick Barone, who ultimately figured out some forms of treatment. So that brings me to the second part of myotonia, the underlying physiology. What is it that actually causes myotonia? What is myotonia at the cellular and molecular level? In essence, myotonia is an error in the instructions for life. We all have DNA. Basically, the blueprint of who we are is encoded in DNA. And we have 3.3 billion letters in our DNA. And a single letter there is sufficient. A change in a single letter is sufficient to cause the disorder. And you may wonder, how is that possible? I mean, we have 3.3 billion letters. How can a single letter cause such a problem? Well, if you consider that the DNA is building instructions. In the healthy individual, let's say, these building instructions bring to connect part A to B and then attach C. Now, a mutation, you take out a single letter and you simply frame shift all the letters by one position. And to connect part A to B and then attach C turns into connect the arta T of A and not very useful, of course. But that illustrates how removal of a single letter in 3 billion can cause significant problems. All of a sudden, the instructions become nonsense. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. As we know from Darwin, mutation is something that happens all the time in life, all the time. It is actually what drives evolution. Sometimes, actually, the exchange of one letter can lead to something better. It can make an organism more capable of dealing with some kind of environmental stress and therefore reproduce more effectively and pass on the genes. That's evolution. So it can improve life. Mutation, per se, is nothing bad. More often than not, it has no consequence. There's no measurable effect of the mutation, but sometimes it becomes a disease, such as myotonia. And sometimes it's very rare, 10 in 100,000 roughly. And it depends on what ethnic group you're looking at, but there are numbers that range from 1 to 10 in 100,000, depending on what group you're looking at. In myotonia, it is ion channels, the instructions for an ion channel that are effective. And it turns out, and Dr. Cannon did a wonderful job in explaining it earlier already at such a high level, I didn't even expect the electrophysiology there. But in essence, when we talk about excitable cells, and I'm talking about, the heart, I'm talking about skeletal muscle, I'm talking about the brain, these are cells that are excitable, they talk to each other. And they talk to each other through electricity. Electricity is move of charged particles. These particles need to move from the outside to the inside of the cell and vice versa. And there are pores in the membrane. You already know what I'm getting to. These pores are called ion channels. They're not just simply pores. It's not like something goes in and comes through. No, these are highly selective pores. They will only let through sodium, or will only let through calcium, or chloride, and so on. Really amazing molecular machines. And it so turns out that in myotonia, the protein encoding one such ion channel, in this case a chloride channel or a sodium channel, the instructions for making this protein are messed up in whatever way. And the protein may work differently, as in the case of sodium channel myotonia, or it may cease to function as the chloride channel myotonia. This is the tough slide. How does myotonia work at the cellular level? If you picture a muscle cell being an enormous, long tube, it will contract, become shorter, because there's information coming in from the brain that tells it to do so. Now, The problem is you have a very large structure here. If you have only one point where the information for contract is coming in, then you have the difficulty that this large structure, the contractile elements in there, actin and myosin, they're sliding past each other is not in unison, because it may pass down the large muscle cell very slowly. So nature came up with a solution for that. It actually invaginates that entire big muscle cell with what's called the T-tubular system. Basically, cavernous extensions of the surface going deep into the muscle fiber. And thereby, the message of excitation contracts and very quickly run over the top of the surface very deep in the fiber. And thereby can that muscle fiber contract as one piece. As Dr. Kennan already pointed out, the muscle cell is usually negative on the inside. How is that happening? Well, I talked about ion channels. I talked about sodium channels and potassium channels. They're all present in that membrane. Usually, at rest, these ion channels, sodium channels, are closed. What I should also mention is there is a small molecular engine in the membrane, the so-called sodium-potassium ATPase, that throws sodium out and potassium in, and basically establishes a chemical gradient. There's more sodium outside than inside. There's more potassium inside than outside. A little bit complicated. But essentially, that makes these ions travel in a certain direction. Sodium always wants to go in. Potassium always wants to go out. And as I mentioned earlier, at rest, the sodium channels are not active. So no sodium can go in. But there is some potassium that can go out. If you have potassium leaving the cell, you have positive charge leaving the cell, making the cell more negative on the inside. And so you establish this negativity of the cell. And of course, there's also a chloride conductance. Chloride is high on the outside, so you go inside. Chloride being negative makes the cell negative on the inside. The thing that makes a muscle contract is encoded in what's called an action potential. We had that term earlier too. The brain is sending down a signal to the muscles to contract, and it does so by sending a certain signal. That signal is a change in the membrane potential. The negativity of the cell is changed briefly to a positivity. And that is accomplished how? It works through sodium rushing into the cell. Remember, sodium is high on the outside, and on the inside it rushes into the cell. Sodium being positive makes the cell more positive on the inside. And then shortly after the sodium channels are done with their job, they fast and activate. And you have potassium channels opening. And potassium is high on the inside, wants to rush out, it rushes out. You have positivity leaving the cell, making the cell negative again. And this action potential is running down the foot process of the neuron, the nerve cell, ends up on the muscle cell, where the action potential is recoded into a chemical message. These are so-called neurotransmitters. And then on the other side in the muscle cell, the action potential is regenerated, and it quickly, oops, that's too fast. Quickly runs down the axon, it's recreated in the muscle and runs down into the T-tubular system. Now, the thing here is, everywhere on the muscle surface, you have potassium leaving, you have sodium entering. At the large extracellular surface of a muscle cell, not a problem. Sodium getting in, potassium leaving, no big deal. No change in potassium concentration. But in the very tight, confined space of the T-tubular system, every potassium that leaves creates a problem, because it elevates the potassium concentration in the T-tubular system. And thereby, it makes it more difficult, so to speak, for potassium to leave. So, in essence, potassium cannot as readily leave the cell anymore, and therefore the cell gets a little bit more positive. And remember, positivity means excitation. Usually, you have the chloride channel that comes to the rescue. ClC1. That's this large conductance here. Despite the fact that potassium cannot leave as readily anymore, you have that chloride channel, and negativity is rushing into the cell, basically holding it at the desired negative value. But what happens if you don't have that channel anymore? All of a sudden, potassium becomes the defining force, the defining factor for the membrane potential, and the membrane potential gets more and more positive. What happens? You have depolarization in the cell, in the muscle cell itself, without input from the brain. And that is myotonia. So you lose the chloride channel, myotonia ensues. Myo, muscle, tonus, tension. How does myotonia look like in a patient? We usually refer to it as cramping, but in essence it's really an inability to relax the muscle. There is this shown warm-up phenomenon that I mentioned earlier. With repeated motion, you will come to a place where the patient is literally asymptomatic, indistinguishable from a normal, healthy individual. But within a very short time, a minute, less, 2 minutes, the individual becomes very myotonic again. Usually there's a lot of muscle mass involved, and there's a temporary weakness that I mentioned earlier. Here's a picture of that muscular hypertrophy. Dr. Trivedi earlier showed these massive calves. I've never really seen a picture like that. But there's also some hypertrophy here, as you can see. I brought a little bit video that I shot at Vanderbilt 15 years ago, probably. A little bit slimmer. And you can see here that I have distinct trouble getting up. The transient weakness here is really almost forcing me back into the chair. And much more than staggering at this point is not possible. For some reason, for me, when I go swimming, my myotonia is extremely pronounced afterwards, and becomes sometimes so myotonic that I really can hardly move. But you can see here, in walking the stairs, by the way, a flight of stairs without rail here, typical scenario is really terrible. If I were to trip here, guaranteed I would fall. Thankfully, I didn't. But you can see already again this warm-up phenomenon. It becomes increasingly fluid in motion. Apparently no problem anymore. And you can see now as I sit down again and get up, the getting up really is not a problem at all anymore. And a quick demonstration of the hand grip myotonia, which is essentially the same thing that I showed earlier. Very difficult to open the hands. And the key here is that it requires a forceful contraction to trigger this response. So if I do things slowly, I can feel it cramping up a little bit right now. But slowly is usually not such a big deal. The disorder can present by itself, so it can be myotonic congenita, and then you have two flavors of Thompson's and of Becker's, which are the dominantly as well as the recessively inherited form. But of course, and that's the reason why I'm standing in front of you, it is also part of other disorders. Here in this context, it's of most interest that it is part of the periodic paralysis phenotype, but it's also part of the myotonic dystrophy. So there's a number of other disorders where this defect is of relevance. Here's a typical test that one can do for a myotonic reaction. It's so-called percussion myotonia. You can see here in the upper left, this is the thigh, and on it is a examination hammer, basically, in neurology, a rubber mallet. And in this picture, what happens is, this is time point 0. You simply hit the muscle with the hammer, and you can see how here the shading here, the shadow, shows how the muscle contracts and it simply will not give away. This is time point 0.9 seconds, 1.4 seconds, 1.3 seconds. This cursor keeps disappearing. 5.8 seconds, and then finally, by roughly 16 seconds, that myotonic reaction is finally gone. This is a very typical thing, and I think in the thigh, actually, the literature always talks about eminence and maybe the tongue, but I think the thigh is most definitely the easiest muscle to demonstrate it on. One thing that I'd like to bring up in terms of myotonia that is really not discussed very much is the conflict of the mind that comes with myotonia. Bell wrote in 1830, "There is neither disease of mind nor of bodily organs, the corporal frame. Nerves and muscles are capable of their functions and proper adjustments. The defect is in the imperfect exercise of the will." And Thompson wrote in 1876, remember, this is a person who himself was afflicted with the disorder. "The seed of the evil is certainly to be sought within the cerebral spinal system, or the brain itself, in that part from which willfulness originates. The will does not achieve contact in appropriate fashion with the organs through the nerves facilitating movement." So you can't help wondering, is there a way for myotonia patients to want the reaction, or will the reaction to end? And in order to answer that question, let's consider briefly how a contraction works. On the left, you have the brain, and it's communicating with the muscle through nervous tissue, through neurons, brain cells. And from the brain comes the message, contract. This is encoded in set action potentials, and the action potential reaches the muscle and it then contracts. Is there a message from the brain to relax? No. It's a simple cessation of the contract command that's decisive for relaxation. So keeping that in mind, and knowing that myotonia finds its origin in muscle, is it possible to will myotonic reactions to stop? It is not possible. It is physiologically impossible. And as they said in Good Will Hunting, it's not your fault. But that's really something that's always on the mind of a myotonia patient. I'm not doing something wrong. And not very much discussed in the literature, but I carry this forward to physicians who deal with myotonia patients. Thompson said, "It affected my psyche very badly and caused great irritability." Isaacs talked about a patient. He said, "The distressing condition was accompanied by moods of depression and extremely labile personality. Her stiffness has made her the object of ridicule at school." Or the malingering thing. "While in the army, he was often accused of malingering at the beginning of calisthenic periods." Calisthenics is body training. "And marches because he was unable to make fast movements without prior lingering." There is certainly great potential for depression. There is reported substance abuse in myotonia. So this is something that really caretakers have to consider, and you should talk about it to your patients. What are the possibilities of us exploring myotonia in the laboratory? There are essentially two ways that we can mimic or actually create myotonia in the laboratory. There's the genetic models, and I think many of you will know the so-called fainting goats on YouTube. The fainting goats are a complete misnomer. They're not fainting, they have myotonia. And there's so many of these videos on the internet. These are genetic models of myotonia, absolutely. There are dogs that have myotonia, cats, there are frogs that have myotonia. And many of the videos that you find on the internet are informative, some are less informative. There was one episode actually of Mythbusters that was somewhat disappointing to me because they were talking about the fainting goats in their usual fashion, and they never even mentioned that myotonia is the problem with these fainting goats. And some videos also on the internet on myotonia congenita are appallingly incorrect. And I've contacted the people that posted these, supposedly myotonia being caused by myosin defects. And I have no idea where these people came up with these ideas, but it's of course completely incorrect. Myotonia, the genetic model of myotonia, we have these in mice. Mice you can genetically alter mice, just like introducing myotonic alterations in the chloride channel. And these mice are severely myotonic in the laboratory, so we can test drugs on these mice. Do the mice react favorably to that treatment? And apart from using these mice, the genetic mice in the laboratory, which unfortunately very difficult to house, and the husbandry of these animals is difficult in that you have trouble breeding them. You can also produce myotonia in a very easy way in the laboratory by simply providing a chloride channel blocker, 9-anthracene carboxylic acid. If you expose a muscle to this chemical, the muscle shows a very clear myotonic reaction, and it's shown here on the right. You can see a display of basically muscle force, where up means more force, down means less force, and we electrically stimulated the muscle. You can see the black trace is control, and then you have the red trace, which shows clear summation effect. And then upon termination of the stimulation, electrical stimulation is terminated, you can see how the muscle has trouble relaxing. See where the arrow is pointing at that remaining force, despite the fact that you're not stimulating that muscle anymore. That muscle is cramping a great deal. And it's just actually two different muscles, extensor digitorum longus and soleus, that are shown here, just as an example of how you can create this myotonic reaction in the laboratory. And that brings me already to the final component here, myotonia therapy. What can we do about myotonia? And I bring up this slide, and I think it might really not be necessary to say this, but I say it regardless. I was contacted at one point by an individual in Indonesia, and he inquired what he should do and how much of the compound he should take. And he was actually going to already take it, but he figured he might give me a call. I forget whether it was an email or an actual phone call. He had gotten his hands on some aftermarket, I think it was mixilotine. And what is the danger here? Mixilotine being an agent that was first created to treat cardiac arrhythmias, heart problems. Almost invariably, almost all of the drugs that are useful in myotonia are sodium channel blockers. Now the problem is sodium channel blockers are found in heart, in muscle, in brain. And they're very much alike. So if you find a drug that works on one, odds are it's going to work on all the sodium channels. And of course, what is the danger with self-medication, which should never be done with any of these compounds, is that a person will try the drug, myotonia is not relieved, they will take more and more and more, and it will end up in cardiac arrest. You can literally die. Apart from liver damage and hearing problems, so for example, if you take too much quinine, you would end up with vision problems and equilibrium problems. But seizures and cardiac arrest definitely in the cards with all of the medication. Why do I say it? Because, well, people ask, of course, all the time about treatment with myotonia. I just say, please talk to your neurologist. How can we measure an effect of an anti-myotonic agent? There are several problems with measurement of the efficacy of an anti-myotonic drug. In humans, there is a distinct day-to-day variance. The same patient can be very different in his or her presentation from one day to the next. In fact, I could be very different from now to 5 hours from now. So that very much influences our ability to really make a good statement, to assess whether a drug works or not, because there's such variability. Also, myotonia patients have invariably adopted a behavior that seeks to hide. This is very predominant, a very common cover-up mechanism, because we sort of don't want to talk about this all the time, explain and then being accused of simulation. So people always hide it. It's like also sore muscle from working out or something of the sort. But there are very effective hiding mechanisms in place, and it becomes almost impossible to turn these off. So as a physician testing these drugs on a patient, it becomes difficult to determine, is that patient still subconsciously trying to hide and thereby influencing the outcome? This is a very real problem. Also, of course, what works in one patient may not work in another. We have various different genetic backgrounds. We are all not made up of the same DNA, but quite different DNA, in fact, and there are so many factors that are not contributing controllable, such that one drug that may work in one person may not work in the next. And finally, what is also critical is we need to consider the history of muscle, the exercise history. That was what Dr. Cannon was talking about earlier, the weakness after rest. If you are assessing a patient who just worked out, or a patient that worked out heavily yesterday, that will be a very different result from the same patient who has not exercised before. So keeping all factors the same is quite difficult. We can measure hand grip strength, we can ask the person to run up a flight of stairs and time them. These are all possible measurements, but they all have great variability in them. And so sometimes, actually, what I find might be the most effective way would be to provide a quality of life assessment through the patient. Really ask the patients, do you feel that this is improving the situation? Of course, the patient has to be blinded to whether it's a placebo or a treatment. How do we figure out these new treatments without going into more details? I talked about the electricity that is the language of cells, how they talk to each other, and it is mediated through these pores, through these ion channels that are gated. So when I see a mutation and when I see that there is a change in the makeup of the channel, I ask, what does it do to the channel? How does it react differently? Is it maybe not open as much? Does it close more quickly? Does it conduct less current? And then we ask, by throwing on a drug, can we fix that situation? Can we rescue, can we rectify the situation to control condition, to the condition that we saw in the channel that is, so to speak, healthy? And if that is true, if I can make the channel work correctly again, can that same drug work in, for example, the mouse model of myotonia? Because that's not necessarily given. When we do experiments and we find a drug that's effective in the particular experimental setup that we use, that does not necessarily translate to it being effective in the whole organism. Or, if it's effective in the mouse, it could very well not be effective in humans. It's a case that happens all the time. The current first line of defense against myotonia is mixilotine. Initially, I thought I was going to talk a lot about the history of how different drugs were evaluated and what we found. Several drugs have been assessed, and some of them have proven somewhat beneficial. Quinine, for example, toconide. But some of these also have rather severe side effects. And so you have to ask yourself, do I want to replace my myotonia with something that's much more serious? Mixilotine apparently works out quite well, as Dr. Giannetti shows now. And as I mentioned earlier, it is the first choice right now, I understand this. But I'm not a physician. I do the preclinical analysis of these things, and so to me, the actual prescription end this is not what I do. In all cases, we always have to keep in mind, how does it affect the brain? How does it affect the heart? And out of this, I have gotten really interested in one particular drug called glucosamine, which is an antiepileptic agent, which basically leaves the normal behavior of sodium channels alone. Many drugs, as I mentioned earlier, for myotonia work on sodium channels, but they play around with the biophysics of the channel. And this drug appears to be somewhat different. This drug appears to not really affect the housekeeping function of the channel, but it basically takes out those channels, stops those channels from working that have been excessively active, so to speak. It's what we call a slow inactivated state. And I apologize for the terrible physiological recording here. This is really not very good recording, but here on the right you can see again this controlled measurement of muscle force. Again, not good physiology there, but if you expose that control muscle, it is electrically stimulated. Again, this is a force measurement going up and down. You stop the electrical excitation and the muscle stops reacting and stops contracting. But if you throw on this 9AC, this chloride channel blocker that I mentioned earlier, it shows the clear myotonic reaction. But what happens if you throw on 9AC as well as glucosamine, and that's what you see here at the bottom, you can see that this strong myotonic inability to relax, this summation here, it's all gone. Basically, this becomes this again. So that's a very good indicator that this drug is working. Unfortunately, right now, it's only working at concentrations that are rather high, and we're concerned about cardiac toxicity right now. But the plan is that we take this molecule, we have found that this molecule works, and now we can chemically alter the molecule. We will design a new molecule and test it. Does it cause problems in the heart? If it does, well, we have to try a different modification of the molecule. Does it go into the brain? There's a mechanism that separates the body, so to speak, from the brain. It's called the blood-brain barrier. We can make that drug traverse, or make it difficult for the drug to traverse that blood-brain barrier, so that the side effects in the brain are very limited. We can thereby basically restrict the action of the drug to muscle. And that's really what we hope we will be doing. So in summary, I hope I'm not going over too much. Myotonia is an inability to relax, and there's really no way to influence that by will. There are certain drug development challenges. We can try and suppress the myotonic reaction, but the issue is always that with the suppression of the myotonic reaction, probably we're subduing some actions in the brain or heart somewhere else. There are several new approaches. In fact, Mark Rich in Ohio now, he published a paper that Lossin appears to work very well. So there's efforts now underway to evaluate these drugs. And one possibility is also that we consider the genetic background of the patients. There is a tendency in the industry to consider, here's a patient, here's patient A with such and such a defect in the channel, and can you possibly tailor therapy just for this patient based on defects that this particular patient has? That's probably what's going to happen. Not now, but there's a tendency or efforts to go that direction, but to really tailor the treatment to one individual patient. And that, in essence, is it. I just wanted to mention briefly my team at UC Davis, Dr. Feldman, who's a very established and seasoned electrophysiologist, a great resource in electrophysiology. And there are unfortunately not all my students here on the picture. Right next to me is Pearl Chen. She's my grad student, and she's doing most of the work on myotonia right now. But unfortunately, all the other students that I have listed here couldn't be in there. There's 4 more students. And with that, I'm finished. Thank you.
This is great. As somebody who experiences myotonia, the question is, as someone who's had personal experience with myotonia, could you describe for us what the threshold is for lifestyle management issues that would make you say, I'm willing to take something, a drug, twice a day or whatever it would take? And just thinking about, I know it's a very personal decision, but sort of the trade-off between lifestyle changes and, if there were something out there, I would really put up with the hassle of taking it twice a day for the rest of my life.
I personally have no problem with taking drugs at all. They just didn't work for me. So Mexilitine doesn't do anything for me, Phenytoin doesn't do anything for me. If it did work, would I consider it? Absolutely. It is quite inhibiting and very frustrating. So if I can replace it by taking a pill a day, not a problem for me at all. But I haven't found anything that's really effective for my case. I find, as far as myotonia is concerned, really, unfortunately, the condition is really exacerbated by emotions. So people that are fighting it more will experience more myotonia. At least that's true in my case. And therefore, it has been suggested that even in the literature that relaxation methods would help. For me, in the beginning, in my early years, it was all defining. That's who I was. I constantly try to anticipate what's going to happen next, worrying about the image that I'm casting, you know, to my peers. I'm not worried that much anymore, but you know, it's still here. I find myself thinking constantly. It's a never-ending thing. How can I walk from A to B? Because I was just sitting for 3 minutes. So if I can get rid of that, of course I will do it. And I don't really consider it a lifestyle change at all to take a couple of pills. But of course, if that limits me in other places, you know, if I have to worry about cardiac side effects, then I would not consider it. Because yes, it is inhibiting, but you know, I'm still happy. I was also considering, you know, should I have children? They're fine. But I think the mental support that you need to give to these patients is really critical in understanding that they're, like you put it on your card, you're not alone. You know? And this is not imaginary. The mental aspect of it is greatly underappreciated in literature. And it's something that should be addressed more.
I don't want to monopolize the questions, but your answer caused me to think of another phenomenon that you mentioned, which is there's been a great deal of difficulty understanding, and I think hasn't been looked at very much, which is this transient weakness that accompanies myotonia. Because it's clearly something very different from periodic paralysis. And I wonder if you would just expand a little bit about, you know, how that weakness compares to the challenges of the stiffness. It's reported to be of extremely short duration, whether that's the case for you, and if you were to fall or something, is that sometimes from this early weakness, or is it always the stiffness and then inability to react to a postural change or something?
To answer your second question first, the tripping and falling is, I would say, invariably due to stiffness. Why? Because you trip and you seize up and there's no fighting involved. What you saw in the video earlier, the tremor was literally fighting against the weakness. So I got up very quickly on purpose, and that can trigger the transient weakness. Is it short? Yes, we're talking about a time frame of seconds, and 10 to 20 seconds, probably less. That's roughly what we're talking about. Usually it fades away, but the stiffness may remain to some degree, but it's hard to separate the two. They usually coincide. What is true is that the transient weakness invariably will go away. The stiffness, not necessarily so. So when you have a situation where the stiffness is pronounced, I might have days where I simply cannot get rid of the myotonia at all with hormones. I'm always limited, you know, like walking in honey. But the transient weakness is never that much of an issue because it will go away.
We have a couple of more questions, but we really also need a break, I think. What should we do? A couple more questions and then we'll... Okay, so...
Okay, so I really appreciate all the questions because I thought I was the oddball talking, really to an audience. I cannot really lecture anything on periodic paralysis, but I'm very happy that I can at least tell you a little bit about my tone.
I'll try. I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but do we have an understanding of what's going on during the warm-up? Why does it get better? And does that give us some notions as to what one can do therapeutically?
My opinion is that it's sodium channel slow inactivation that is responsible for it. And I don't know whether that's supported. I put that in writing at some point. And people have not fought against it terribly. But this sodium channel slow inactivation is a property of the sodium channels where, I think I have to go into gating a little bit. A sodium channel, when it sees negative membrane potential, is closed. Upon depolarization, that sodium channel will open up. Now, that opening up is almost immediately followed by what's called fast inactivation. There is a lid, so to speak, that closes the channel from the inside very quickly. Then you have to hyperpolarize. You have to get the channel back to a very negative potential again for that lid to go away and for the channel to be open up to basically have that channel available again for activity. Apart from these three very basic main states, there's a fourth state, the slow inactivated state, that can be entered only if the channel is exposed for a very long period to depolarization. So we're talking about a scenario where the cell, for some reason, is for a very long time positive on the inside. Not necessarily sustained, but maybe at a very high frequency changing the membrane potential for a very long time. And then the channels, when they have entered that state, depending on how long they have been depolarized before, it takes them forever to get out of that slow inactivated state. And I think the kinetics work out fine. I mean, temporarily, it makes sense to me. There are many hypotheses about the warm-up phenomenon, and some of them I think really just don't make sense in terms of time. I remember one time when I was talking to physicians, and they talked about how the warm-up phenomenon would take 5 minutes. That's ludicrous. No way. It doesn't take that long. So you cannot consider processes that take that long. You have to consider processes that make sense in time, that can deliver the effect in that short period of time, and then retract again and lead to myotonia. So my personal opinion is slow inactivation might be involved. It's a very long answer. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I apologize. How many more folks have questions? 1, 2, 3. So I think if you can catch Dr. Lossin on the break, it would be good. But we kind of have to take a break and end that. But Chris, really, you give such a great perspective of a disorder that's a sister disorder to what we have, and it's really, and the fact that you have it and you've pursued science to try to fix it, you're like the definition of a hero. And, thank you so much for giving us your insights.
That's very kind. I like the research that I do, and I hope I can continue doing it for a long time. And I really, really enjoy giving this talk. In fact, it's quite honestly the first time that I give a talk about myotonia, reveal the fact that I'm myself myotonic. Why? Because I usually hide it. I'm not interested in drawing the attention to me, but it gives a new perspective, I guess, to the entire thing. And it's really quite rewarding and insightful. I've never seen a patient with myotonia myself. Ever. That's how rare this is. So I think it's wonderful that you come together and as an association you talk to each other and you can share information and solutions. And I'm really inspired to do the same for myotonia. So thank you for having me here.